welcome back to my channel. Today I have another true crime ASMR video for you to enjoy. Today we will be discussing the Red Ripper, or as he was formerly known, Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei had raped, killed, and mutilated at least 52 women and children in Russia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and this was all between 1978 and 1990. And this case is so prominent because during this time, the Soviet police did nothing to notify the public of the heinous crimes that were being committed, simply because the country's ideology at the time asserted that serial murder was impossible in a communist society. So today, we will be diving into this case. This case involves a lot of Russian, Ukrainian names that I will absolutely butcher in this video. And I just want to apologize up front for that. Also, quick side note, I had promised a true crime video on Marilyn Monroe, but that is going to be somewhat delayed. I've attempted the video itself multiple times, and I was not satisfied with it. So once I am satisfied, I will let you know, because that will be when it is uploaded. So, as always, I will be adding this video to my true crime ASMR series playlist. And this is where you can find past and future videos in this series. If you have any recommendations or thoughts, please let me know in the comments below. I'm very open to suggestions for future video topics. Now, let's get into it. Andrei Chikatilo was born on October 16th, 1936 in Yabloknov, USSR. Andrei's life growing up was, as they usually are, tumultuous. He was growing up in the aftermath of the Great Ukrainian Famine of 1930, during which time millions of people died, and some had even turned to cannibalism to survive. When Andrei was only 5 years old, his mother would tell him that he had an older brother named Stephen, and that Stephen had disappeared, and the family believed he had been kidnapped and eaten by the neighbors. From an early age, Andrei was fascinated by this story and often wondered what happened to his brother. And he really fixated on the cannibalistic parts of the story. Andrei's father would be conscripted into the army as World War II began. Andrei's father would unfortunately be captured by the Germans and would not return home until well after the war. And despite going to fight for his country and being captured, he was not welcome with welcoming arms. He was branded by the Stalinist regime as a traitor for allowing himself to be caught. Even though Andrei was only 10 years old, when his dad returned, he was already a devoted communist and openly criticized his own father for his betrayal. His father's capture led to Andrei becoming the center of bullying at school as well. During Andrei's time at school, he was an avid reader with a particular interest in stories that described how German prisoners were tortured by their Soviet captors during World War II. He's just reading about how his father was tortured and then, being a jerk about it when he goes home. How nice. In addition to his external issues, like this family issues, being bullied, Andrei was believed to have suffered from hydrocephalus, which means water on the brain at birth. And this caused him genital urinary tract problems later in life, including bedwetting into his late adolescence, and later turned into the inability to sustain an erection, although he was able to ejaculate. Because of this, he became painfully shy. His only sexual experience during adolescence occurred at age 15, and it was reported he overpowered a young girl, ejaculating immediately during the brief struggle, for which he received even more ridicule. This humiliation colored all future sexual experiences and kind of cemented his association of sex with violence. When applying for university, Andrei had failed his entrance exam to Moscow State University. And a spell of national service was followed by a move to Rodionovo-Nesvetievsky, a town near Rostov, in 1960. He failed the Moscow State University exam and blamed his dad's standing in the war instead of holding himself accountable. But because he failed, he went on to be a telephone engineer. His younger sister moved in with him and was very concerned by his lack of success with women. So she orchestrated a date with a local girl named Faina, whom he went to marry 3 years later in 1963. Despite his sexual problems and lack of interest in conventional sex, they produced 2 children and would live an outwardly normal family life. In 1971, Andrei would change careers to become a school teacher, although a string of complaints about indecent assaults on young children forced him to move from school to school. One of these assaults included Andrei being caught trying to abuse a sleeping boy, but thankfully he was stopped by several senior students who would go on to attack and beat him. This is when Andrei decided to move him and his family to a city called Shakti, which was near Rostov. In 1978, Andrew would kill his first victim, 9-year-old Lena Zaktinova. I'm really trying. Her body would not be found till 2 days later in the Grashovka River. In December of 1978, the police would actually call Andrei in for questioning, but released him shortly after when his wife confirmed his story that he had been home with her the entire evening. Even though the evidence against Andrei was very strong, police would arrest another person named Alexander Kravchenko, a local man who had previously served 6 years of a 10-year prison sentence for the rape and murder of a 17-year-old girl in 1970. The police had managed to obtain a confession from Alexander, and after a short trial, he was found guilty of the murder of Lena and sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp. Hearing the verdict, the people of Shakti lodged an official complaint against the leniency of that sentence. A new judge was appointed, and Kravchenko was given the death sentence, which he didn't even do it. Anyway, perhaps as a result of his closeness, that close brush with the law, there were no more documented victims for the next 3 years. And he was still being just identified by claims of child abuse. Andrei was finding it impossible to find another teaching job. And when he was made redundant from his mining school job in early 1981, aka he was fired, he would then take on a job as a clerk for a raw materials factory in Rostov. And this job required him traveling, and there was a lot of it. This position gave him unlimited access to a wide range of young victims over the next 9 years. And the body count would only rise from there. Larissa Tekchenko, who was 17, would become his next victim. On September 3rd, 1981, Andrei strangled, stabbed, and gagged her with dirt and leaves to prevent her from crying out. The brutal force afforded Andrei his sexual release, and it became his pattern of attack that saw him focusing on young runaways of both sexes. He would befriend them at train stations and bus stops before luring them into nearby forest areas. This is where he would attack them, attempt to rape, and then use his knife to mutilate them. In a number of cases, he ate the sexual organs or removed other body parts, such as the tips of their noses or tongues. In the earliest cases, the common pattern was to inflict damage to the eye area, slashing across the sockets and removing the eyeballs in many cases. An act which Andrei would later attribute to a belief that his victims kept an imprint of his face in their eyes even after death. On June 12th, 1982, while on another business trip to the town of Zapaskia, he killed 13-year-old Lyuba Buryuk after following her from a bus stop after a failed attempt at rape. He produced a knife and stabbed her repeatedly, including several wounds to her eyes. At the time of her death, it was really hot, and by the time they found her body, almost 2 weeks later, her body was a skeleton. And now we're going to be going through the year of 1982. And this is when Andrei really goes on this killing spree. There's a lot of people who fall victim to him in this time. On July 25th, 1982, Andrei kills a 14-year-old girl named Lyshoba Valboshiva. On August 13th, he would kill a 9-year-old girl named Olga Postisheva. On August 16th, he would kill a 16-year-old girl named Olga. On September 8th, he would kill a 9-year-old boy named Ira. On September 15th, 1982, he killed a 15-year-old boy named Sergei. And on December 11th of 1982, he would finish the year of 1982 with the murder of a 10-year-old girl named Olga. Andrei, who was well known as being shy and impotent, had learned how to choose his victims. His travels for work would take him to many railways and bus stations, and that's where he flourished. He was able to coerce these young kids of both sexes to go with him. Mostly he would promise food or similar treats that lured them into isolated tracts of forest that bordered Russian towns. On some occasions, the victims would offer sexual favors in exchange for food or whatever Andrei happened to be offering at the time. But there was nothing that they could offer for him besides their lives. And unfortunately, once they met him, they were doomed. Now, again, the law system back then was lacking for the public. Runaway kids were known as vagrants, or vagrants, however you would pronounce it, and they were not reported as missing because to the law, these people did not exist. Andrei knew no one was looking for these kids and capitalized on their need to survive. The only time people even knew these kids were missing was when their bodies were found. And that is so sad. It is so sad. in 1982. In 1983, Andrei's crimes would continue, and he would go on to kill 8 more people. He would murder a 15-year-old named Lore in June of 1983, a 13-year-old girl named Ira, and a 7-year-old boy named Igor in July, a 7-year-old boy named Igor in August, and a 22-year-old woman named Valja, and an 18-year-old Jane Doe in September. And in that fall, a 19-year-old named Vera and a 14-year-old named Sergei. At the end of 1983, the total number of victims had risen to 17, of which only 6 had been found. The Central Moscow militia were concerned by the number of dead children that were being reported by the local police, and they sent Major Mikhail Fetisov and his team to Rostov to take over the investigation. Soon after his arrival, Fetisov reviewed the situation and sent a scathing report to his superiors in Moscow, criticizing the local police and suggesting that all 6 murders were the work of a single sex-crazed killer. And he was not far off, now was he? Moscow headquarters reluctantly accepted his findings, but fell short of calling the perpetrator a serial killer, as that was seen to be purely just Western phenomenon and not possible in Russian culture. Because at the end of the day, we aren't all just humans, are we? So, as most of the bodies had been recovered from woodlands, the case was known unofficially as the Lesopolosa, however you say it, or the forest strip killings. With each body, the forensic evidence was just piling up, and police were convinced that the killer had the blood type AB, as evidenced by the semen samples collected from a number of crime scenes. Samples of identical gray hair was also retrieved, and when a further 15 victims were added during the course of 1984, police efforts were increased drastically. A little too late, but anyway. And the police were mounting massive surveillance operations that canvassed most local transport hubs. Andrei was arrested for behaving suspiciously at a bus station at this time, but again avoided suspicion on the murder charges. This was because his blood type did not match the suspect profile. However, he was imprisoned for 3 months for a number of just minor outstanding offenses. During 1984, one of Andrei's victims was his former mistress, named Tanya. She was 32 at this time, and this crime scene was very important because they finally found evidence about the murderer. A footprint. What was not realized at the time was that Andrei's actual blood type, type A, was different to the type found in his other bodily fluids, type AB, as he was a member of a minority group known as non-secretors. These are people whose blood type cannot be inferred by anything other than a blood sample. was only made up on SVU. It's real. As police only had a sample of semen and not blood from the crime scenes, Andrei was able to escape suspicion of murder. Following his release, Andrei found work as a traveling buyer for a train company and managed to keep a low profile until August of 1985. And this is when he murdered 2 women in separate incidents. Around the same time as these murders, the leading investigator, Barakov, frustrated at the lack of positive progress, and he had asked for the help of a psychiatrist, Alexander Buchnovsky, who refined the profile of the killer. Buchnovsky described the killer as a necrosadist, or someone who achieves sexual gratification from the suffering and death of others. He came up with a lot of really helpful identifiers of the serial killer, and had placed the killer's age between 45 and 50, which was significantly older than had been believed up to that point. Desperate to catch the killer, Barakov even interviewed a serial killer, Anatoly Slivko, shortly before his execution in an attempt to gain some insight into this Red Ripper. Coinciding with this attempt to understand the mind of the killer, the attacks seemed to dry up, and police suspected that their target might have stopped killing, been incarcerated, or had died. However, early in 1988, Andrei again resumed his killing. The majority were occurring away from the Rostov area. He knew that they were watching all the train stops, and victims were no longer taken from local public transport outlets as police surveillance of these areas continued. Over the next 2 years, the body count increased by a further 19 victims, and it appeared that the killer was taking increasing risks by abducting and killing his victims in very public settings. In March of 1989, Andrei would kill a 16-year-old girl named Tatiana. The crime occurred at his daughter's apartment in Shakti. It had been empty since his daughter had divorced her husband and moved back with her parents. After Chikatilo lured the 16-year-old girl inside, he gave her vodka and seduced her. After stabbing her and violating her body, he realized that he could not leave her body at the house. He would then take a kitchen knife and decapitate her and saw off her legs before wrapping her in rags and articles of clothing. He then bundles her to a sled belonging to a neighbor and dragged her through the streets to the area where he dumped her remains. On August 19th, 1989, Andrei would kill a 19-year-old girl named Jelena Varga. He killed her while he was on his way to his father's birthday party. Seeing the 19-year-old at a bus stop, he offered to walk her home, but instead lured her into the woods and stabbed her. After cutting out her uterus and slicing off part of her face, he wrapped the remains in clothing and left for the party. On August 29th, Andrei would kill a 10-year-old boy, and after stabbing him to death, he buried him in the cemetery. When police were recovering the bodies, many of them were missing parts. Females were missing their uterus and nipples, and the males had genitals, and occasionally tongues sliced or bitten off. In his last year of freedom, Andrei would go on to kill 8 more victims. On November 6th, 1990, Andrei would kill a 22-year-old woman who had went with him to the woods near the train station. She was beaten, stabbed, and mutilated. Andrei had actually removed the tip of her tongue and both nipples and ate them at the scene before he covered her naked body with leaves and branches. As Andrei returned to the station, he saw 4 women and a man standing on the platform. That man was a policeman who noted Andrei walking from the wood and wiping sweat from his face, which the sweat was probably blood. Anyway, on November 20th, 1990, Andrei was at work. As his bandaged finger, which had been bitten by one of his victims, was aching badly, he left work and went to a nearby clinic for x-rays. After receiving treatment for the finger, which was broken, he went home. Shortly after arriving home, he went out to buy beer. On the way, he attempted to talk to a young boy, but was scared off when a woman approached. He walked further until he met another boy that he engaged in conversation, until the boy was called away by his mother. As he continued on, 3 men in leather jackets approached him and identified themselves as policemen. One of the men then handcuffed Andrei and told him that he was under arrest. He was transported to the office of Mikhail Fetisov at the regional headquarters of the Department of Internal Affairs. Andrei, who had made no attempt to resist the arrest, did not speak the entire trip. On the day he was arrested, Andrei had a briefcase with him that contained a knife, a length of rope, and a jar of Vaseline. And I wonder what his plans were for the day, you know? At first, Andrei refused to confess to any of the killings, but soon would. The police had a psychiatrist come to speak to Andrei and interview him to understand the mind of a killer from a scientific aspect. Andrei was, of course, flattered by this, and it worked in the police's favor, as Andrei would provide extensive details of all of his killings, and even led police to the site of bodies that were undiscovered. Andrei claimed to have taken the lives of 56 victims, although only 53 of these could be verified. This figure was far in excess of the 36 cases that the police had initially attributed to their serial killer. Andrei would be declared sane and fit to stand trial. He would go to court on April 14th, 1992. Throughout the trial, he was held in an iron cage designed to keep him apart from the relatives of his many victims. Andrei would be referred to as the maniac. His behavior in court ranged from bored to manic. singing, talking in gibberish, and at one point he was even reported as having dropped his trousers and waving his genitals at the assembled crowd. The judge appeared less than impartial, often overruling Andrei's defense lawyer, and it was clear that Andrei's guilt was a foregone conclusion. The trial lasted until August, and surprisingly, given the judge's bias, the verdict was not announced until 2 months later, on October 15th, 1992. Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty on 52 of the 53 murder charges, and he was sentenced to death for each of the murders. Andrei's appeal centered around the claim that the psych eval, which had found him fit to stand trial, was biased, but this process was unsuccessful. And I think he really did think that he could come off as crazy. I think that's why he was trying to sing and talk gibberish, obviously to commit crimes at this many. There's obviously something wrong, but we'll just continue. 16 months later, Andrei was executed by a shot to the back of the head on February 14th, 1994. The psychiatrist who had been instrumental in his capture, Alexander Buchnovsky, went on to become a celebrated expert on sexual disorders and serial killers. Alright, so that is today's video on the Red Ripper. For my final thoughts on this one, I sometimes don't agree with the death penalty, as I believe jail is a real punishment. I do. That stripping of freedom and all that I believe is usually a good enough punishment. But I think in this case, the death penalty was needed. Andrei had no remorse, and I honestly think he would be the person, and I'm not saying he wasn't terrified of jail. He probably was. But he would be the person to make the most of jail. I think he would flourish there. And I just think that it was needed. And that is that. My heart aches for these people who fell victim to this monster of a man. But the law systems in Russia, Ukraine, that whole area was who failed them, ultimately. I think it is absolutely absurd that they could ever even state that because they were communists, serial killers couldn't happen. And I just think that is so absurd. Just ridiculous. But anyway, I hope that you found this video relaxing and enjoyable. I will be adding this video, as always, to my True Crime ASMR series playlist. And this is where you can find past and future videos in this series. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. And I hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much for watching, guys. And please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Future video topics, let me spooky.